Good morning. My name is Donna Thomas and I'm a research fellow at the University of Central Lancashire, and I work in a research centre called the Centre for Children and Young People's Participation. And as a centre, we do a lot of work with children and young people at an international and national level. So we work with the Council of Europe, for example, researching and advocating children's rights. And we get commissioned off different organisations to explore different areas of social life with children and young people. And for the next 20 minutes, I wanted to talk about an area of our work, which is exploring the nature of self, experience and reality with children and young people. So I'm going to talk about why this work is important with children and young people, and think about where we are now in social sciences in terms of epistemology and ontology, thinking about what we think about self currently, and what reality is and the implications that has at the moment in terms of supporting children and young people, and especially children and young people that are in crisis. And that is very much on the increase at the moment, especially in the Western societies and particularly in the UK as well. To try and exemplify this, I will discuss a pilot study that we've just completed that goes to children and young people themselves to start to explore questions around the nature of self, looking at what kinds of experiences children and young people are having and what that can reveal really about the nature of self and reality. So I'll talk a little bit about that, a bit around the methodology, but more importantly trying to focus on some of the initial findings that's come out of that now, and then discuss some of the next steps and where this work is going on a more international level as well. So why is it important that we explore with children and young people the nature of self, experience and reality? Well, there are lots of reasons why this is really important. First of all, in social science, and particularly in social science research, we meet people from an assumption about what we are as human beings. And this has huge implications for how we provide services and support, not just children and young people, but adults as well, because it is a social science issue, but we're specifically talking about children and young people here. And children and young people are often absent from studies of this kind, anything that's related to consciousness studies or research concerned with non-conventional experiences, transformational experiences. They're absent from that, and there's lots of reasons for that. There's some arguments around children's egos aren't developed enough to look at that, or they're not reliable research informants, which we could very much argue these points, but we don't have time here. So it's important because children and young people are having, they're experiencing the world in quite different ways, and almost rebelling against these systems that we have in place at the moment, these systems that are very much in crisis as well. And there's a real ordinariness at the moment to a spectrum of non-ordinary experiences that children and young people are having, and we don't capture them in social science and social research. We very much value the idea of policy-driven experiences that kind of position children and young people into a conceptual self, and we'll talk about that as we go along as well. It's important because it's about developing a set of different kinds of research methods. It's about having the courage to do research differently. And when we do research with children and young people, we are inclined to use non-traditional research methods, which might be art, it may be play, it may be music, but it's those methods that kind of access deeper levels of self and bring out that creativity. And it's what can children teach us about that, and how can those methods be applied to exploring the nature of self and reality with children and young people. As the work moves forward, and I'll talk briefly about this at the end, it's very important to look at how adults in authority are responding to how children experience their self and others and the world, because there are implications at the moment for adults who also have quite a mainstream view of self and reality, that are responding to children and people in particular ways that could be catalysing more suffering that's actually necessary. And for us to be able to look at what that means on a global level and consider different social cultural responses to very similar kinds of experiences, it is a big an important part of this work as well. So it's really valuable to look at where we are now in terms of, in social science, how we understand self, and where we might need to go to for this to be more meaningful, for not just for children and young people, but for adults as well. But in 1934, Herbert Mead, he published Mind, Society and Self, and it was quite radical at the time because most of his contemporaries approached the idea of self as very biological, a brain in a body, and anything about that was down to what we inherit from our parents and grandparents. But what Mead proposed was the idea that self wasn't really like that, and it was very emergent, very transient, but it was held in a relationship to a pre-existing world outside of itself, so a world of things and objects. And sadly, this hasn't really changed that much. Maybe it's changing a little more on an academic level, but certainly in practice, in social research with people, we've not moved away from these ideas whatsoever, and this is having implications as well. And there's lots of turns in social sciences. So instead of looking at the ontology of what is the nature of reality, we stay with these old assumptions and quite worn out assumptions, and we just build theory on top. And we're left with all these turns in social science, whether it's narrative, postmodern, reflexive, post-human, but each turn positions self and reality in a particular way. And we all tend to come at it from all these different angles. So there's multiple genealogies around the self in social science as well. The most recent term is post-human, and this has been very useful in kind of decentering the idea of a mind-body I or a mind-body self, and really brings in the idea that we're very connected to everything around us and in our field, so the universe, the stars, material objects and other people. But what it doesn't do is really give us that idea of self or subjectivity or agency. It's a very, very flat ontology. There is no reality. There's just assemblage of things that are coming together and dispersing in every moment. But in social science, self and subjectivity, and particularly agency, is really important. It's the idea of needing to retain that kind of diverse and wonderful idea of individuality, and people really being able to express experiences on that level in order to create change, and reconciling that with a bigger picture almost of, well, actually self maybe much more than this mind, body, I. But it's been good in moving away from that postmodern idea of individuality. And in social science, lived experience is a massive thing as well, but that's also questionable, because in social research, that lived experience always comes from the story I or the conceptual I, and we don't really take it any further than that. But story eyes and conceptual eyes can be very deeply conditioned from political, social and cultural forces, and it doesn't tend to be unpicked. We take that truth and that knowledge from that kind of surface level idea of self. And what's interesting is that in other scholarships, such as consciousness studies and quantum physics, they're really offering new possibilities of not just the nature of reality, but what self could mean, and what the eye of experience is. So this work is very much about kind of harnessing that and thinking about how can we bring that into social sciences, and especially when we're researching with people, but how can we bring children and young people into these areas of scholarship to inform how their ideas of ontology are developing, So we have people like Bernardo Kastrup, who kind of posits this consciousness only model where people are alters or expressions, localizations of a consciousness that is the ground of being, and people like Philip Goff, who look at panpsychism and suggest that kind of subject combination idea that each little thing it has consciousness. And then we have someone like Bellman's who has this dual monist approach and talks about, well, you know, consciousness could be the ground, but there's all these other things to consider. And it's thinking about, you know, how can we bring these ideas in to have a more meaningful and a more powerful explanatory framework of reality that can really support children and young people and adults too in social science research. So we decided instead to keep looking at the theory and ontology and epistemology to go directly to children and young people themselves. And we did this through a pilot study called Who Am I? Exploring the Nature of Self, Reality, Experiencing Reality with Children and Young People. And this was a small, very deep, very qualitative study that worked with 10 children and young people and using very innovative and interdisciplinary creative research methods in a very slow and deep way with children and young people. And I don't have time to talk about the methodology in this presentation, but please contact me if you do want more information about the methodology. My contact details will be at the end. But we did use self-inquiry techniques, art, dance, movement, mandala making, along with also narrative as well, to try and capture those kind of different expressions of self as well. And in terms of the findings, we focused on three things really. The first was self. So it was trying to get an understanding with children about the nature of self to the best that we can, because it is a very tricky and slippery thing, as you're all probably aware. And we also wanted to capture the spectrum of experiences that children and young people were having, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But also importantly, to kind of listen to and understand children and young people's ideas about the nature of reality from their own perceptions, but more importantly from their own experiences as well, which I do talk about as we go along. But just first of all, starting with self, just to bring your attention to the diagram. And, you know, just to reinforce that it's extremely difficult, you know, the job that we had to try and even talk about this in any kind of way was extremely difficult as well. We started the research by asking a simple question, can you tell me a bit about yourself? And of course that when we ask, you know, we're all, as human beings, we're natural storytellers, and we will tell a story quite a default position, and that's what happened with children and young people. So the first level of self, and I'm using the word level really crudely, we identified the conceptual I, and this was kind of the story I, and this is where children talked about, you know, their self as name and age, and this is where you find conceptual objects such as hobbies and passions and things that were going on, and the me and the mineness was here, and that's why I've put possession there. So things were mine, including people as well. And on this level of self, a real diverse and beautiful expression of differences. So every child and young person just had this wonderful individuality on this level as well. And quickly moving on, as children and young people began to share what we term non-conventional experiences, and these are experiences that could be peak or transformational, they could be speaking with dead grandparents, it could be having premonitions, and I'm going to talk about that more on the next slide. We found that children and young people, there was kind of an epistemic shift at this point, and you know how they talked about this became more difficult. So as they moved out of the conceptual I, language became, it wasn't sufficient for them to be able to relay these more non-conventional experiences, and that's when the art and the other methods came into play at this point. And the transpersonal I was more feeling, intuition, metaphor and imagery to try and convey their experiences, descriptions of time really slowing down, so a different perception and experience of time, and non-linearity. So with the conceptual I and the storytelling, there's this linear idea or this linear perception of this happened and this happened and this happened, this is who I am, and then that and then that. But when we move to the transpersonal I, it's very spatial. There isn't really any linearity to that, and especially again when they're talking about these non-conventional experiences. And then as we started to do and facilitate the self-inquiry methods with children and young people, silence became very kind of prolific. It became very loud almost, and children would fall into a silence that I started to term as kind of an epistemic bridge between these senses of self almost. And children couldn't really relay their experience at this level of I, at this level of self. The best was they began to kind of try to work with mandala, which was extremely difficult, and they're still doing that at the moment. Non-verbal, no words. The best we had with verbal was I don't know, or it's just unknowing. It's unknowing, which led us to this idea of it seemed to be a knowing element that was present across all their experiences that couldn't really be verbalized, that had a sameness to it. So where we had this difference and diversity of the conceptual I, when we come down to what we call the knowing I, or that knowing element of experience, it was the same for each child and young person despite their conceptual differences at that level. And just I realise I'm quickly running through this because I want to talk about some of the findings as well. These two pictures represent, they come from the study, represent this kind of transpersonal I. And this one here, this was a 16-year-old girl who was trying to convey her experience of having some kind of empathic abilities, and she said this was her in the middle, and her in the middle, the transpersonal I, was a combination of this person, her friend, and herself at the conceptual level. So she was trying to express that here. And this drawing is from a little boy who's 8 years old, who sees himself more here at the level, a light body with this knowing I, which is actually looks like an I, which is really interesting. And your soul is you. And interestingly, that this little boy, he comes from a very secular background, so this word was quite interesting here. So just rushing through now, when we asked children and young people why they joined the study, that was the key question to enable them to start to talk about any kind of non-conventional experiences that they'd had. We had so many examples of what we'd call non-conventional experience. So we have children and young people who talk to dead grandparents. There is sleep paralysis, there is lucid dreaming, there are premonitions, there are unseen beings, which can take the form of human beings or beings out of this world, or animals. Animals featured largely with children and young people. Transformational experiences in nature where a sense of self is completely dropped, and children and young people have found themselves, their idea of self, as being one with the world, everyone else, and the universe as well. So we had a vast range of different experiences from children and young people. And this picture was drawn by a 17-year-old girl. She has quite a long backstory, but she was hearing helpful voices and she couldn't convey this very well. And the image tries to represent the idea of a tunnel and time slowing down, and a chorus of similar what she describes as robotic voices, but then when we unpicked that, it meant more that they were very slow, so time was slowing down here. But what the study captured was the reactions and responses of adults in authority, and adults in authority can be teachers, more often than not parents, which is quite interesting, and of course professionals, because some of these children and young people do access services as well, and it seems to be the same thing. So an example is, you've done that, you've got schizophrenia, let's get you to the doctor, you need medication. So there's a real pattern here of a knee-jerk response that adults in authority don't seem to have that understanding or that kind of open-mindedness to actually exploring with children, well, what does this mean? It's straight away to the kind of mainstream idea view of you're unwell, disordered, or it's not real, so you're silenced as well. So that came out of the research quite heavily. And we do have children in crisis. We have a huge crisis at the minute, and this is mirrored in the response that what we're doing on a social level. A GP, diagnosis, somewhere like CAMHS, and medicated, and at the very worst incarcerated. So this is why this work is so important, to start to explore with children and young people what these experiences mean, and what can they reveal about who we are and what we are as human beings, which is, you know, the crux of the research as well. So children had some really quite interesting views about the nature of reality, and really expressed that in quite a no-nonsense way as well. And these views probably come from a mixture of pop culture, a mixture of family influences, but more often than not from their own direct experiences, and especially for these children who have had an array of non-conventional and transformational experiences. But just to give you some examples, reality is that we're all one, we're all connected. There's kind of a God that's holding everybody, the world, holding the world and the universe, and I'm referring to the picture here. No gender, no face, because it's not really a person. And some young people, well, it's a hologram, so it's like when you kind of die in a video game and you get rebooted, or I can't remember the actual term for it, but some really interesting. And when we think about what's coming out of quantum physics or consciousness studies, the scientists are pretty much saying the same thing. So it's how do we kind of reconcile and match these experiences with what's coming out of these other disciplines as well. So just to summarise, there is really a need to reconsider what self is and what it means to be human in social science, and particularly in social research with people, so that we can really inform in a more meaningful way how we can be together as a society, but also support people who do need support, especially at the moment as well. We need to return to the questions about the nature of reality instead of to keep building on these assumptions, which is what we tend to do in social sciences. And we need to do this in a very interdisciplinary way. We need to also think about experience and be more inclusive in social science about the types of experiences that we value and that we listen to and not dismiss, and look at what experience can tell us actually about the nature of self, because many of the experiences that have come up in this study start to really think about self as not being in the body and not being in the mind, but mind almost being non-local, and children having access almost to kind of different versions of reality, or there's something going on that's pointing to the idea that we're not a self in a mind, in a body, in a brain. It seems to be much more than that, and that's really important. The role of children in this are extremely important, and we need to start to consider children more as a good source of authority, reliable and competent researchers, and as they're showing, competent philosophers as well. And we also need to consider the holistic approach in terms of families and adults, because how adults and parents especially are responding to children and young people is having huge implications for their suffering and crisis. So it tends to need a holistic approach. And just to finish really quickly, the next steps for this is we are currently applying for a substantial research grant to enable this pilot study to be more of a global international study, so we can really capture other cultures and how adults and the communities and cultures are responding to similar sets of experiences that children in the West are having, and what can that teach us almost in the West about how we can start to respond to children and how they're experiencing self, others and the world. And already we have a lot of interest in this work and some fantastic people who are coming on board. It is interdisciplinary, and as a social scientist, it's about getting help from experts in other fields such as maybe transpersonal psychology, quantum physics, particularly philosophy, and consciousness studies as well. And already we're having that support around the work, which is just absolutely wonderful. The next stage is we're bringing children in as researchers. So children who have been part of this study will come do some of the research training and really inform the design, particularly the methodology, and in what ways we can approach especially self-inquiry in a more meaningful way with children and young people as well. So if you are interested in the work, or I'm sorry I didn't have chance to talk more about the methodology, for example, please do contact me. It'd be lovely to talk about the work and get some of your opinions and views on this as well. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening or watching. Thank you.